Hey guys, tonight, we drift gently into the calm, earthy world of Aztec gardeners and their floating farms. Yes, actual islands of mud and plants gliding like sleepy green carpets across a vast, misty lake. Picture yourself in the cool dawn light of ancient Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec Empire, where the air smells faintly of wet reeds and crushed marigold. You're gliding on a wooden canoe, barely disturbing the glassy surface of Lake Xochimilco. A distant splash echoes probably a heron plunging for breakfast. You pass other canoes stacked with cornstalks and chilies, their rowers still yawning. The floating gardens or chinampas slowly rise into view, anchored in neat rows. From a distance, they look like calm green boats tied to the horizon. But don't let the tranquility fool you if someone dropped you in the middle of this agricultural labyrinth with no canoe, no knowledge of what's edible, and zero mosquito tolerance. You probably wouldn't last more than a day. The bugs are aggressive, the mud is knee-deep quicksand in places, and oh yes, some of the locals might consider you an omens-delivering ghost. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere distant, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun seeing where this sleepy river flows. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your canoe bumps gently against the bank of a chinampa. It's a curious sensation. This isn't a real island after all. You step onto it and feel the soft squish of centuries-old compost underfoot. These floating gardens are made from layers upon layers of lake mud decaying vegetation, and if rumors are to be believed, the occasional sacrificed rabbit. Everything feels damp, but not soggy, and the plants, corn, beans, amaranth rise up around you like sleepy soldiers in green armor. The air is humid, but gentle. Nearby, a farmer is bent over a patch of tomatoes, humming softly. The tune might be old, even by Aztec standards. You watch as he gently strokes the leaves, not to clean them or test them, but just as a kind of greeting. Plants here are family. These chinampas are not drifting freely. They're fixed in place with stakes driven deep into the lake bed, usually made of ahuejote or willow trees. These living anchors not only keep the garden stable, they also provide shade, wind breaks, and habitat for birds. You spot a cormorant perched on one, eyeing you like you've interrupted its nap. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs invented this technique entirely on their own or inherited it from earlier civilizations like the Xochimilca. Either way, the result is mesmerizing, a patchwork of green geometry stretching out over the water, connected by canoe-wide canals. You stoop and run your fingers through the soil. It's not really dirt in the traditional sense. It's more like lake lasagna, thin layers of sediment, muck, decayed water hyacinths, and ground-up aquatic weeds. This blend, called talali, is nutrient-rich and self-renewing. It's nature's version of a never-ending compost pile, and thanks to the lake's seasonal flooding, the chinampas get a fresh serving every year, no artificial fertilizers needed. Still, the Aztecs didn't just rely on nature to do the heavy lifting. No, they added their own flair. Farmers would paddle out in canoes with woven baskets full of dried duck droppings, crushed limestone, and pulverized freshwater snail shells. Organic, yes. Smelly profoundly. Effective incredibly. A light wind picks up, rustling the stalks of maize, which are planted in ritual grids. Corn, after all, wasn't just food, it was a deity. In fact, you're technically walking through divine territory. Every row of crops here serves a practical and spiritual purpose. The beans climb the corn. The squash sprawls underneath. And somewhere nearby, a tiny shrine is tucked beneath a squash leaf, offering cornmeal and flower petals to Chicomecoatl, the goddess of sustenance. You pause by a small patch of marigolds, bright orange and yellow warm, even under the overcast sky. These aren't just for decoration. The Aztecs believed marigolds guided souls in the afterlife and warded off illness in this one. They were used in medicine cooking, and if a neighbor had seriously annoyed you, mild curses. Speaking of neighbors, you're not alone. On the next garden over, a woman is whispering something to a row of chilies. Her hands hover over the plants like she's casting a spell. In a way, she is. The Aztecs believed in speaking kindly to crops to encourage growth. Considering the size of her peppers, it seems to be working. You take a step closer and notice she's holding a small pouch of— what is that crushed turquoise? No ground obsidian mixed with dried aloe, and maybe a hint of cacao. Gardeners here often used plant magic and mineral brews not just for fertilizing but for protecting their plots from pests and bad energy. Now it's not all idyllic. Earlier, you nearly tripped on a sunken canoe someone had tried to camouflage with reeds. And further along, a stretch of chinampa has collapsed into the water. No one's maintained it in weeks. But even this decay feels oddly peaceful, like nature gently reclaiming a misplaced tile from her watery quilt. You hear the dull thump of a drum in the distance, signaling sunrise. The city is stirring. Canoes begin gliding in every direction, ferrying vegetables gossip and probably one or two late-night revelers pretending to be early risers. And as the light rises over Lake Xochimilco, illuminating rows upon rows of floating gardens, you realize this place is not just a farm. It's a living map. Each plant, each pathway, even each puddle has been cultivated not only for survival, but for harmony with nature, with gods, and with the neighbors whose chili plants always seem just a little spicier than yours. You shift your weight and feel the chinampa gently respond beneath your feet. It's not floating exactly like a raft, but there's a give to the ground, like standing on a dense sponge soaked in lake water. The early light glimmers across the canals, revealing the mosaic of plants in every shade of green and ochre. A farmer nearby grunts as he lifts a basket of muck, dragging it up from a canoe half submerged with dark, sludgy goodness. Welcome to the world of Aztec mud engineering. You trail behind the farmer who doesn't seem to mind your silent company. He plops the basket down and begins layering its contents onto the edge of a newly forming chinampa. This, you realize, is the beginning of an island, an actual functioning crop platform being built one scoop of sludge at a time. There's no blueprint, no chalk line, just an inherited memory of how to shape the earth atop the water. The method is time-tested. First, they drive stakes, usually willow or cypress, deep into the soft lake bed, outlining a rectangle. Then they weave reeds between the stakes to form walls. Once the frame's in place, they begin the glorious work of mud packing. Dredged silt from the lake, rich with organic decay, gets dumped inside, mixed with rotting vegetation, old corn husks, and sometimes fish bones. The whole thing is layered like a lasagna, only smellier. You're offered a paddle to help stir a fresh batch of tlali, and you politely decline your sleepwear isn't exactly muck-friendly. The farmer laughs. He knows. This entire process is as much art as agriculture. The Aztecs weren't simply growing food. They were mastering aquatic terrain. These gardens could reach up to 90 meters long and support enough maize to feed a family for months. And because the lake surrounds each chinampa, they never had to worry much about irrigation. Water was always a few inches away. But they did worry about balance. Too much mud on one side and the garden could slump or split. Too few willow roots and the whole structure might float away in a storm. Historians still argue whether certain chinampas were designed to drift slightly or were always meant to be fixed. What's agreed on the builders had a very intimate relationship with mud. At one point, you notice the farmer pause to inspect a patch of algae growing along the edge. He flicks it aside and mutters something about bad lake spirits. You make a note to never disrespect Aztec algae. Your journey takes you deeper into the building zone's areas where old chinampas are being reinforced. Here, the work is more communal. You see groups of workers pulling ropey reeds into bundles, then laying them as the base layer over the older structures. Some hum, others tell jokes. One young boy is trying to balance a frog on his head for reasons known only to him, and perhaps the frog. You crouch and scoop up a handful of the topsoil. It smells earthy sweet and faintly aquatic like lake tea. You notice tiny white granules mixed in crushed snail shells, a natural calcium boost. The Aztecs had no chemical fertilizers, but they didn't need them. Duck droppings, decomposing fish, even bat guano from nearby caves all found their way into this miraculous dirt. You silently admire their composting commitment, especially since the average person today can barely remember to rinse a recycling bin. One elder woman gestures for you to help her carry a bundle of tulle reeds. They're light but coarse, and you quickly realize she's not using them for gardening. Instead, she's weaving them into what looks like a long snake-like mat. These mats are placed between the muddy layers to keep the soil from shifting natural rebar in a way. She nods approvingly when you steady the bundle like a pro, or at least not like a complete outsider. The sun climbs higher now and the mud glistens. A few egrets tiptoe along the edges of the water, stabbing at unlucky minnows. A small lizard zips between two maize stalks and disappears. The garden breathes. You realize these islands are not just plant platforms. They're entire ecosystems teeming with insects, birds, amphibians, and those unbothered farmers who barely seem to notice you're tagging along. Near the center of one large chinampa, you come across a curious sight, a pile of obsidian shards arranged in a spiral. No crops are growing here, just a ring of squash blossoms surrounding the spiral. The farmer nearby shrugs and says it's a soil prayer. Whether it's superstition, art, or science, he doesn't explain. But he does offer you a blossom to sniff. It's fragrant and slightly nutty. The Aztecs used these blossoms in soup sauces and more than one rain-inviting spell. You walk a little farther and find yourself ankle-deep in water where a chinampa has partially collapsed. No one seems alarmed. They'll rebuild it later. One boy is already floating mud balls down the stream like tiny ships. It feels almost meditative watching silt swirl in the lazy current, knowing this very mud may soon be cradling someone's breakfast corn. Back on dryish ground, a farmer pulls up a small net from the water, revealing a squirming mess of axolotls, the smiling amphibians that never really grow up. These little lake monsters aren't just cute, they were a protein-rich delicacy and sacred to certain gods. The farmer smiles as one tries to climb over the edge of the net, only to flop back down with theatrical flair. By now, your sandals are thick with mud, your senses tuned to every rustle of reed and splash of paddle. There's something timeless here. No matter how many centuries have passed or how many empires have come and gone, mud still rules this lake. And honestly, it's kind of perfect. A world made from gooey muck lovingly piled up into floating rectangles, all so someone could enjoy fresh chili peppers and sweet corn. You don't need a palace. You need good soil and someone willing to share a squash blossom. You start to notice patterns not just in the way the chinampas are built, but in what grows on them. These aren't random gardens. There's a deep, deliberate choreography to Aztec planting one that makes your local grocery store's organic section look like chaos in comparison. On your left, corn towers proudly stalks straight as lances. Climbing its sides are bean vines weaving upward like curious green snakes. At the base, squash sprawls out in starburst patterns, its broad leaves shading the soil and stifling weeds. This trio, corn, bean, squash, is known today as the Three Sisters, and the Aztecs were master choreographers of their dance. Each crop supports the others in a lovely little circle of life. Corn gives the beans something to climb. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil, and squash prevents moisture from escaping, while giving pests a spiky surprise if they dare to nibble. Historians still debate whether this system was a result of long agricultural study or if it evolved from ritual farming practices passed down through centuries. Either way, it worked, and the chinampas buzzed with life because of it. Further along the canal, you pass rows of amaranth, delicate and swaying with feathery tops that look almost too pretty to eat. But eat it they did. High in protein, rich in vitamins, and practically indestructible amaranth was sacred. It was also a tax crop. Farmers owed a portion of their harvest to the state. So yes, even back then you couldn't escape the IRS of imperial agriculture. And then there are the chilies. Oh, the chilies. Dozens of varieties from wrinkled black pods to bright red spears, all grown with the careful attention usually reserved for prize roses. You pause at a plot of chiltepans, tiny but deadly. A nearby farmer warns you with a smile, "Don't touch unless you want to remember this in your dreams." But food wasn't the only thing planted here. You spot a line of Kempolk sokittle, the same marigolds seen earlier flanking a border. Not merely decoration, they served as natural insect repellents and spiritual sentinels. Their pungent scent and vivid color were said to confuse evil spirits. You lean in close. They're definitely confusing your sinuses. Then, unexpectedly, you come across a patch of something minty and sharp epazote, a pungent herb used in tamales and bean stews. The Aztecs believed it warded off intestinal trouble and possibly nosy guests. Right next to it, chia. Yes, that chia. Packed with omega-3s before that was trendy. It's hard not to chuckle thinking the same tiny seeds in your cousin's overpriced smoothie once fed Aztec warriors before battle. A light breeze stirs the water, and you catch the scent of something unfamiliar, smoky, sweet. You follow your nose to a cluster of vanilla orchids, their vines hugging a post in elegant spirals. Wild vanilla grew in the region, and though the Aztecs hadn't mastered pollination quite like later cultures would, they harvested the pods for flavoring. Imagine it a hot chocolate made with vanilla chili and a bit of ground maize. Morning energy and afternoon attitude in one steaming mug. Near the vanilla vines, someone's built a tiny shelter from reeds. Inside, you spot bundles of drying herbs, tlalquequetzal, a now-forgotten sedative herb, and cuetlaxochitl, the ancestor of the modern poinsettia. Though now mostly holiday decor, it was once a medicine and a symbol of life's cycle. You inhale gently and feel your pulse slow. Maybe it's the herb, maybe it's just the mood. And just when you think you've seen the full Aztec pantry, a young girl comes running down a muddy path holding what looks like seaweed. Not quite. It's spirulina, a green-blue algae scooped from the lake and dried into cakes, packed with protein, harvested with nets, and fed to warriors and nobles alike. You try to imagine convincing a modern teenager to eat pond goo for breakfast. You rest on a low bench woven from reeds. All around you, crops stretch upward in perfect humming stillness. No tractors, no drones, no fluorescent grow lights. Just sun soil and a lot of old-fashioned human will. And it wasn't just about calories. These gardens produced medicine dye plants, incense ingredients, and ceremonial offerings. You spy a cluster of copal trees near the garden's edge, their resin harvested and burned in temples. The Aztecs didn't separate food from faith. Growing a chili could be an act of devotion. Harvesting squash blossoms might involve a quiet prayer. Even choosing where to plant could mean consulting a priest. One older man nearby is fussing with a small plot where nothing seems to be growing. He sighs and pulls out a pouch of white dust, crushed shell maybe, and sprinkles it across the surface in a slow, methodical motion. He mutters a few words, then carefully places a small carved frog figurine in the center. You're not sure if this is science, superstition, or just gardening with flair, but he seems satisfied. Later, as the light starts to dip toward gold, the gardeners begin to wrap up. A boy collects beans in a reed basket. A woman stacks chilies on a drying rack woven like a tight net. You can hear someone singing low and tuneless, but calming like the lullaby of soil and sweat. You lie back on the bank of the canal and gaze upward. A dragonfly hovers overhead, darting left, right, then gone. The air is thick with the warm scent of crushed herbs, the soft gurgle of water against mud, and the gentle rustle of leaves. This garden is more than a floating farm. It's a memory alive, rooted in water, and anchored by a people who saw no boundary between the sacred and the everyday. As you stretch your legs and trail along the canal's edge, something curious catches your eye. A man squatting beside a clump of squash vines, holding what looks suspiciously like a flute. But as he blows into it, instead of music, it emits a stream of high-pitched chirps. A few moments later, a swarm of insects buzzes out of the foliage and flies off. You blink. Welcome to Aztec Pest Control. Turns out this man isn't serenading bugs, he's mimicking the calls of insect predators, a clever acoustic trick passed down over generations. In the absence of pesticides or scarecrows in overalls, the Aztecs turned to their rich understanding of sound, smell, and timing. Some gardeners swore by hanging reflective bits of mica or obsidian to confuse pests. Others burned certain herbs to keep leaf munchers at bay. You walk past a section where a trio of gardeners are methodically brushing a dusty gray powder onto chili plants. It smells vaguely like limestone and old eggs. One of them cheerfully explains that it's crushed duck eggshell mixed with lime, a blend known to deter aphids. You nod, trying not to inhale too deeply. In the next plot, an elderly woman squats beside a low patch of tlalhuayatl, a type of Aztec mint, and carefully scatters the plant's leaves around maize stalks. "Keeps the worms from getting cocky," she says with a wink. This deep knowledge of symbiotic planting wasn't limited to bugs. Aztec gardeners were experts at understanding which crops liked to grow together and which ones needed space, what we might now call companion planting. Tomatoes and marigolds, beans and sunflowers. Even plants that weren't edible were part of the plan. Some offered shade, others lured pollinators, and a few simply made the garden smell like someone had spilled an ancient herbal candle. You step around a large rectangular frame made of reeds and filled with water. It looks like a pond, but inside fish flit between clumps of algae and water hyacinth. One young boy is tossing handfuls of something that looks like crushed cornmeal into the water. Fish nursery, he explains, and sometimes dinner. Indeed, the chinampas weren't only for plants. Fish farming, especially species like acasil, a type of crayfish, and charala's tiny silverfish, was integrated right into the garden system. The Aztecs were doing aquaponics before it became a TED Talk. You pause beside a large clay jar tucked under a willow. Its lid is off, and you peer inside to find worms. Dozens of fat-wriggling earthworms happily munching their way through scraps of maize husks and chili stems. One gardener notices your look and proudly announces compost engineers. Turns out even the worms were on payroll. But managing pests and partners wasn't always peaceful. You pass a plot that's been half dug up the soil, churned like something had thrashed through it. A man nearby holds up a broken reed basket. "Badger again," he sighs. Apparently, local wildlife also enjoyed free organic produce. To counter these intrusions, the Aztecs deployed passive defenses. Some chinampas were ringed with spiky reeds, others used raised platforms or suspended baskets for sensitive crops. And more than one farmer kept a dog or two not just as pets, but as furry, snarling bodyguards for the amaranth patch. You catch sight of one such dog now lounging on a sun-warmed stone. It's a Soloitzkintli, a hairless ancient breed with wrinkled skin and a look of total judgment. It watches you with one eye, then closes it slowly as if to say, "You're fine for now." And then there's the real mussel ducks. Yes, ducks. Entire flocks were herded through the chinampas, snacking on slugs, trimming weeds, and fertilizing the soil with every enthusiastic waddle. You spot a man paddling a flat-bottomed canoe with a dozen ducks inside. "Patrol shift," he jokes, nodding to his feathery team. You start to appreciate how nothing in these floating gardens was left to chance. Even the timing of planting was mapped to the Aztec calendar, which divided the year into 18 months of 20 days each. There were feast days for corn celebrations for chili, and yes, an entire day devoted to honoring bugs that didn't ruin your beans. Historians still argue whether some of these pest strategies were spiritual or purely practical. When you see bundles of dried rattlesnake skin hanging beside a maize patch, you're not sure whether they're there to scare crows, appease a rain god, or just make visitors mildly uncomfortable. Around midday, you pass a shaded arbor made from woven willow beneath which a group of gardeners is taking their break. They sip from clay mugs, probably atoll a warm maize drink, and joke about the season's bean yield. One mentions that the nightshade plants near the edge have been growing a little too well and might need thinning. "Last year, a deer ate the whole lot and looked like it regretted it instantly," someone chuckles. The conversation turns to bees, or more precisely stingless bees known as meliponines, which the Aztecs kept in hollow logs and clay tubes. Their honey was medicinal, their wax used in ceremonies. You're invited to taste a drop from a tiny pot. It's floral, sharp, almost spicy. You lick your lips and feel strangely honored. Not far from the bee logs, someone's tapping on a small wooden frame, humming a rhythmic tune as they do. The sound travels. A group of children across the garden lifts their heads and comes running not to play but to help move a delicate plant from one chinampa to another. Apparently, the tapping is a signal. You realize this garden has its own language, spoken not in words, but in sense taps, birdsong, and water. And when something goes wrong, a withering vine, a dried-out patch, it's not just ignored, it's studied, discussed. Healers might be called. The garden is alive, and so is the community around it. You crouch near the edge of one plot where maize has just begun to sprout. The shoots are tiny, barely thumb-high. A small woven doll sits beside the row, its face painted with ash. It's a gift for Tlaloc, the rain god. Whether Tlaloc checks in on Tuesdays or not, the gesture speaks to something deeper. A reverence for the uncertain, the uncontrollable, the uncontested fact that no matter how clever your system is, you still need the sky to cooperate. A breeze moves through the reeds again. The ducks honk. Somewhere a flute calls insects into retreat. You're standing in a garden older than most nations, more balanced than most diets, and far more efficient than your herb window box back home. It's quiet here, but never still. Always a rustle, a ripple, a whisper between leaves, and always something growing, protected not by sprays and fences, but by wisdom and rhythm passed hand to calloused hand. You wander farther into the Chinampa maze, now following a narrow path where the soil feels springy underfoot. The garden here opens into a more spacious plot, dotted with squat storage huts and wicker bins stacked with dried herbs. You notice rows of curious-looking gourds, each with a thin slit carved into its side. As you lean closer, a faint scent of fermented maize hits your nose. A passing gardener grins and gestures Polk starter. Ah, the drinks department. Tonight's walk brings you into the heart of the Aztec garden's kitchen, though there's no kitchen in sight. Every plant here has a flavor, a purpose, a role to play in the great culinary puzzle of daily Aztec life. And while maize beans and squash still hold court as the Three Sisters, the supporting cast is much larger and stranger than you might have guessed. You stop before a thick patch of huozontli, a tall, gangly green that looks a bit like overconfident broccoli. It's used like spinach, but with a slightly bitter, nutty kick, perfect for wrapping around cheese or tamales. Aztec nobles loved the stuff. One merchant supposedly paid his annual taxes in it. Talk about leafy green economics. Further along, clusters of chaya grow under woven palm shades. You've probably never eaten it. It's mildly toxic, unless cooked, but once prepared, it's rich in iron and calcium. The locals joke that it keeps you strong enough to carry your canoe and calm enough to paddle it. As you munch an imaginary leaf taco, you pass into a shaded grove of cacao trees, planted just far enough apart to let the breeze move through. A boy guards them with an almost priestly reverence. Cacao beans weren't just for drinking, they were literal currency. A single cacao bean could buy you a tamal. 100 might score you a rabbit. And if you were truly wealthy, you might drink your cacao warm, spiced with chili and thickened with maize flour. A royal milkshake Aztec edition. But let's not forget chili peppers. They grow in proud clumps here, twisting gleaming red and green like Christmas in hell. Some are so hot, they're used more for deterrent than dining. In fact, one ancient punishment for rowdy children involved tossing chili smoke into misbehaving noses. So yes, Aztec parenting's spicy. The smell near one patch of chilies makes your eyes water slightly. You move on. Next up are the edible flowers. You spot Chempoalxochitl marigolds, bright enough to burn through twilight. They're scattered in salads brewed into calming teas and offered to the gods during ceremonies. One elder plucks a few petals and folds them into a warm flatbread, handing you a piece with a wink. Good for dreams, he says. You chew thoughtfully, even though it's an imaginary snack, and drift toward a low bed of amarantha seed so vital to the Aztec diet that Spanish colonizers tried to outlaw it. Why? Because it was tied too deeply to indigenous ceremonies. You crouch to run your fingers through a pile of harvested amaranth seeds. They feel like tiny beads of warmth. High in protein, easy to grow, and weirdly poppable when toasted, they were often shaped into ceremonial figures only to be eaten after rituals. Yes, the Aztecs basically invented edible action figures. The deeper into this kitchen garden you go, the more unexpected plants appear. There's epazote, a pungent herb used to flavor beans and tame digestion. There's avocado grown in small groves along the higher banks, prized for its fat-rich flesh, and occasionally used as hair treatment. And tecojote, a fruit that looks like a cross between a crabapple and an existential crisis. Sour, firm, but excellent in sauces. You even pass what looks like a cactus forest, dotted with prickly pears nopales. Harvested when young and tender, they're chopped into salads or grilled and served with lime. One gardener tells you the mucilage helps with digestion. Another says it keeps your skin soft. A third just shrugs and says it's tasty. Historians still argue whether the full range of the Aztec diet included imported ingredients from trade routes reaching far south into Central America, or if those tales are slightly embroidered by later chroniclers. What's clear, though, is that this was no bland garden. The Aztecs didn't just grow food, they curated flavor. You follow a woman now who's holding a clay jug filled with what looks like thick, pinkish paste. She sits beneath a willow, pulls out a small wooden whisk, and stirs. After a few minutes, the liquid starts to froth. Pozole, she says, motioning for you to sit. It's a fermented maize drink, lightly alcoholic, traditionally consumed to boost strength before a long journey or ritual. She offers you an imaginary sip. You pretend to drink, and she nods approvingly. Everywhere around you, the logic of this edible landscape becomes more clear. The plants aren't randomly placed, they're grouped by use. Medicinal herbs in one-corner grains and legumes in concentric spirals, fruit-bearing trees at the perimeter to shield from wind. Aromatic shrubs form informal fences. The whole thing is like a living cookbook co-authored by centuries of hands. And food in this world isn't just fuel, it's philosophy, it's ritual. You come across a small clearing where incense smoke curls around a flat stone altar. On it sits a small stack of tamales, each wrapped in corn husks, dotted with red beans. An offering, perhaps for Tlaloc or Chicomecoatl, the maize goddess. Maybe both. Maybe it doesn't matter. The garden is watching. You imagine yourself sitting down cross-legged in the dirt, tamal in hand-duck waddling past marigolds rustling overhead. You've wandered through a pantry from the past, a place where every meal is earned by sweat and sun, but nothing is wasted, and flavor isn't just desired, it's revered. One last turn, and you find yourself before a shallow dish filled with white crystal salt collected from the nearby lakes of Texcoco. Even salt in this world comes from a place of reverence. You're told it was once taxed, once sacred, once used to bless newborns. You stand slowly. The flavors have left a trail behind you, earthy, smoky, a hint of ferment and fire. You can almost taste the tortilla that never existed. And as the wind picks up again, shaking the reeds and stirring the scent of chili into the air, you know that this kitchen, floating or not, is more than a garden. It's a feast for the sleeping mind. You find yourself drawn toward the edge of the Chinampa maze now, where the plants grow wilder and taller, and the buzz of insects competes gently with the slap of water against wooden stakes. Here you begin to notice something strange, structures built into the garden, not for growing but for listening, recording, and preserving knowledge. That's right. These floating gardens weren't just food factories. They were living libraries, education hubs, even little seed-powered science labs. You pass a group of teenage students sitting in a semicircle, each with a woven mat, a gourd of water, and what looks suspiciously like homework. Their teacher, an elder with braids streaked in gray, is speaking softly about soil rotation, flood cycles, and the best time to plant exochital flowers so they bloom in time for mid-spring ceremonies. You pause, leaning in. The Aztecs didn't separate agriculture from schooling. If you were a student, noble, or commoner, your lessons included how to coax tomatoes from volcanic mud, how to balance a floating island with reeds and stakes, and how to predict seasonal rains by observing the color of sunrise. Forget math class, this was math with mud. You crouch by a small signpost made from carved wood. It has a series of etched glyphs symbols representing Rain-Maze the moon, a kind of gardening calendar, you're told. The Aztecs tracked planting schedules with their 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar one, weaving the two together like roots in fertile soil. Certain crops had to be planted when the days and gods aligned just right. Mess it up and your harvest might fall flat or worse, offend a deity. You nod gravely. Divine gardening pressure. You notice another hut with a drying rack outside, lined with rows of maize in every color you can imagine: deep blue, sunset, orange, ash gray, and speckled pink. The genetic diversity here is staggering. Some varieties are bred for flour, others for popping, others for ceremonial dishes so old that even locals shrug and say, "My grandma made it like this." And the knowledge isn't written in dusty scrolls, it's passed through songs, chants, and recipes whispered between generations. Historians still argue whether this level of agricultural sophistication arose solely within the Valley of Mexico or was inherited and adapted from neighboring cultures like the Mixtec and Zapotec. Either way, the outcome is visible here on these floating rows of multicolored corn and chattering ducklings. It's a civilization that studied its soil like scripture. You turn and find a reed-covered platform where two gardeners are experimenting. One is laying crushed volcanic rock tazontal in the soil, explaining that it helps with drainage. The other is sprinkling ground chili powder near the roots of beans to deter pests. Not just for spice, after all. You squint and realize what you're witnessing: a proto-laboratory, a space where ancestral trial and error becomes the curriculum. Nearby, a series of gourds hang from a frame, each labeled with the name of the seed inside. There are hundreds of beans shaped like moons, squash with ridged shells, grains so tiny you have to lean in close to see their colors. You're told this is a tlachtoli, a seed storybook. Each seed is linked to a tale, a memory. One grew best after a frog sang nearby. Another only sprouted when planted by someone born on a wind day. You're not sure if it's folklore or field notes. You decide it's both. You pass a small reed-walled schoolroom, more of a shelter really, where children are reciting chants to remember seasonal cycles. One line sticks with you: maize when the moon swells, beans when the air is still. It sounds like a lullaby disguised as a lesson. You hum it softly to yourself. Then there's the part of the garden no one talks much about: the experimental plots. You see rows of foreign-looking plants here. You overhear a conversation brought from far south: see if it grows. This is where the Aztecs tested imports from their vast trade routes stretching from the Gulf Coast to the highlands of Guatemala. They were part farmer, part trader, part adaptation specialist. You dip your hand into a clay bowl of fermented water beside one test plot. A gardener shrugs to see if the seeds float. Only the strongest sink. That's an old trick still used today. Seed selection by flotation. Somewhere a modern agriculturalist is nodding in appreciation. As you drift along the edge of the Chinampa, you see a small altar built from mud brick. Offerings sit neatly in front: beans, flowers, and what appears to be a carved avocado pit in the shape of a frog. It's dedicated to Zilonan, goddess of young maize, not corn, the metaphor of corn. Growth, hope, renewal. Even science, in a sense, cloaked in the poetry of soil. The sun has dipped now behind a curtain of clouds, and torches are lit at regular intervals. Their flickering light casts dancing shadows across the crops, making the leaves seem alive, whispering lessons to one another in rustled syllables. The air smells of damp earth and burning copal resin. You walk slowly past a pile of broken pottery fragments etched with glyphs. One scholar tells you these might have held herbal tinctures or perhaps experimental soil samples. Another says they were cracked on purpose to release their spirit back into the garden. No one is entirely sure. But everyone treats them with respect. Even broken things grow new stories here. One last scene unfolds as you approach a round stone table. A circle of elders is seated with cups of foamed cacao, speaking quietly. A teenager asks, "Why don't we plant onions?" One elder laughs softly. "We do, but they're shy." Another nods solemnly. "Onions come when the moon smiles." Everyone chuckles. The lesson lands all the same. This garden, this floating classroom, is more than a place to grow lunch. It's where memory grows roots and rituals become biology, where seeds are spoken to and weeds are judged by their spirit, not just their spread, and as the breeze carries the scent of wet herbs and distant rain, you realize you've been walking through wisdom. And the ground beneath your feet, this mud, this plank, this floating island, it's not just soil, it's story. By now, your feet are weary, but it's a good kind of tired, like walking home after a long festival. You've drifted from garden bed, from chilly patches to classroom huts, and now, with the last torchlight reflecting off the inky water, you arrive at the edges of something much bigger than farming. This part of the Chinampa, it's about ritual. You're not just walking through vegetables anymore. You're stepping into belief, into ceremonies, into the sacred heartbeat of an empire that fed itself with both maize and meaning. A boy passes you, his face painted with yellow ochre, balancing a basket of marigold petals. He tosses them in deliberate looping arcs onto a floating raft woven entirely from reeds. It's not a garden, it's an altar. Tonight, they're honoring Tlaloc, the rain god. You hear drums low and echoing like thunder on the lake. The Aztecs believed every crop had a spirit, every sprout a destiny. Harvests weren't guaranteed, they were negotiated. And those negotiations happened here where gardens met gods. You spot a circle of maize cobs stacked like spokes in a wheel. An offering, maybe a plea. The air around it shimmers with incense smoke and something more faith, maybe. Or just humidity. Hard to say. Historians still debate how much of Aztec agriculture was shaped by state religion and how much by local custom. Some argue the massive ceremonial calendar dictated planting schedules down to the week. Others think the rituals were added later, layered over practices already passed through generations. Either way, the result was the same, a culture where prayer and pest control shared the same calendar. You pause beside a woman sprinkling ground amaranth into the soil while chanting a lullaby. She tells you she's planting it for the Day of Skulls, a festival weeks away. You raise an eyebrow. But it won't bloom by then. She smiles. It's not for blooming. It's for remembering. This isn't farming. This is time travel by trowel. In a clearing lit by clay oil lamps, you see a feast being prepared. Tamales stuffed with squash blossoms, cups of fermented maguey sap, and trays of what you swear are spicy chocolate tortillas. Food, yes, but also offerings. Some of these dishes won't be eaten. They'll be left at shrines or floated out onto the water as gifts for spirits. You're told even the lake eats sometimes. You wander into a quieter grove, less crops, more flowers. Tall stalks of Chempok-Sockitl sway in the breeze, their golden heads bowing toward you like sleepy monks. This space is called Xochimilpan Place of Flowers. Not for food, not for medicine, just beauty. Imagine that. A whole garden just for color and scent and spirit. The Aztecs believed flowers spoke the language of the gods. Some historians still puzzle over how these ornamental plots were maintained amid such utilitarian pressure. But they were, because not everything has to be practical. Some things are just for joy. A young girl is arranging cut flowers into a crown, while her grandmother braids long vines into a ceremonial sash. They're preparing for a ritual that will thank the lake itself, because water wasn't a resource, it was kin. And these Chinampas, they weren't just floating gardens. They were offerings. Daily prayers made out of mud and maize. You remember that calendar glyph you saw earlier, and now it clicks. These rituals weren't occasional, they were constant, a cycle as predictable and necessary as rainfall. And the whole Chinampa system was stitched into that cycle like embroidery on a sacred cloak. Suddenly you hear a splash. A boy has jumped into the water to retrieve a floating candle raft that drifted loose. He climbs back up soaked and grinning, the raft intact. Everyone applauds gently. It's not just cute, it's symbolic. No ritual is allowed to wander too far, even the small ones. You approach a final platform ringed with stone statues. Each one represents an agricultural deity: Chicomecoatl, goddess of sustenance; Sentiotl, god of maize, and a few with chipped faces that no one quite agrees on. This one might be Hui Mikai Huitl, someone says. Or maybe just a guardian spirit of the gardens. The line between fact and folklore paper thin. And honestly irrelevant. In the Chinampas, they're all family. Now the wind has shifted. The scent of the lake is stronger. The clouds hug the mountains in the distance, and everything is wrapped in that kind of nighttime stillness where even frogs croak more softly. You take one last look over your shoulder. The torches are dimmer now, the gardeners are gone, but the floating islands remain quietly bobbing under starlight. Not just gardens, but memories. Not just food, but faith. And as your boat glides gently away from the edge of the last Chinampa, you know you've seen something rare, a civilization that grew crops, not just with tools, but with poetry. This, you think, is how the Aztecs fed millions. Not just with calories, but with meaning. The water laps softly against your boat now as it pulls away from the last glowing torch on the Chinampa edge. The sounds fade, a final splash. A bird calling once, then nothing but quiet ripples. You sink a little deeper into the cushions, letting your breathing slow to match the rhythm of the paddles. The floating gardens shrink in the distance, their green outlines blurring gently into the black velvet of the lake. The air is still heavy with the scent of soil and old flowers. You close your eyes for a moment. When you open them, stars wink above, mirrored below by the water. Everything feels suspended, weightless, floating like a Chinampa at rest. You think about that boy saving the candle raft, the girl singing to amaranth, the farmers tasting wind and watching clouds as if they were sacred texts. The rhythm of planting and praising, of growing and letting go. There's no rush now. No more facts, no more footsteps. Just breath and water and the long echo of forgotten prayers drifting in the night air. You're not in a history lesson anymore. You're in the garden's dream. And maybe, just maybe, it's dreaming you back. Sleep is close now like a mist rolling off the lake. Let it carry you,